Welcome back. Great to have you with me today. We're going to unpack just a little bit what it means to be, in the words of Peter Ishwell, remember, from Don't Look Up, what it means to be lifestyle idealists, right? That was the accusation, that's the label that was attached to us as people who live under the dome, people that have excluded or pushed out the supernatural God, other, as unnecessary, as redundant, not necessarily as non-existent, just as not core to meaning making and flourishing. What does it mean then to be lifestyle idealists, to be people who run away from pain and run towards pleasure? What does that mean for me to live in a pain pleasure world, coined by David Williams, I think? Well, life is all about then expressing my individuality. And this episode was brought to you by Franklin Lime. Lightly sparkling wine. Not really, but I was just expressing my individuality and my freedom that I feel within to do this, even while the cameras are off. A pain pleasure culture tells you that your freedom and your happiness is your greatest good, right? That's the highest, loftiest goal for which we as individuals can attain. And look, I'm not going to speak down on it. Like, that's a pretty good goal, right? If you're living your life to actually aim for freedom and happiness, that's a good thing. But the meaning of that, or the outworking of that, means that anything that restricts happiness, or anything that is seen to restrict freedom, well, that needs to then be dispatched. You need to get rid of it. That's the logical conclusion. The meaning of life, writes David Williams, is to pursue your own pleasure as you define it, and so be true to yourself. Because of course, we want to be true to ourselves, but your great pleasure, your greatest pleasure, may not be my greatest pleasure, because you're you and I me. So pursue your great pleasure, and therefore be true to yourself. The problem in all of this, the great irony, is that if you look around society, if you look around your neighborhood, if you look at your workplace, if you look at your uni or at school, like, how many people do you know genuinely are actually living fulfilled, peaceful lives, right? Like, that's not to say that the people you look at, or maybe yourself, that you don't have moments of happiness or moments of being at peace, but either you look at people who are just driven by this anxiety, a fear of missing out, or a fear of not measuring up, or anxious about not maximizing their opportunity. And like, mate, the world is just full of people scurrying around like worker ants, anxious and driven, and it's not the picture of fulfillment, it's not the picture of happiness and peace that you might expect. We live in an age really defined by anxiety. David Williams says this, he writes this: as people trying to live out the pain-pleasure worldview, they discover that it doesn't set them free. Instead, it feels like their head's going to explode. Pain-pleasure says, I have to be true to myself. But what does that mean? There are so many options out there, so many choices. I hardly know what I want. And when I do think I've found something worth living for, a month later, a shinier, more attractive alternative appears around the corner. So I feel like my head's going to explode, because I'm supposed to be flourishing, but actually I'm just getting more anxious and stressed. In the pain-pleasure world, I have an emotional hole in my heart, and I'm stuffing things into the hole, but they never satisfy. I want to be free and happy, but I feel trapped and lonely. Says David Williams, that is the pain-pleasure. That is the secular worldview. I love how author and pastor Mark Sayers says it. He writes this. He says, we find ourselves in the midst of a beautiful apocalypse while everything falls apart, while looking beautiful. Friends, that's so many of us. Just check your Insta account. That's many of our kids. Go check their TikTok account. If you're on TikTok, good on you. So many of our friends, so many of our kids, so many of us are creating these carefully cultivated personas and images on Facebook, if you're still using that, if you're over 40, Insta, TikTok, all the social messenger, social kind of platform, media platforms. We're cultivating these perfect images. We look beautiful, but we're falling apart. We're struggling with our mental health. We're struggling with anxiety. We're struggling with depression. And I'm not saying this as a person that's judging anyone. No, I'm saying this as someone who's medicated myself, right? Like this is an endemic, epidemic, pandemic. Okay, I'm trying to think of anything else that starts with emic. Anemic, but that changes the flow. But you get what I'm saying. We'll delete that, right? This is an epidemic. It's been exacerbated by COVID, right? It's like the lockdowns of 2020 took it to a whole nother level. I came across a meme recently. I was educated by our digital guru of all, in charge of all things digital, who said it's not a meme. All right, so that probably reflects my demographic and which generation I'm from, an old one. A meme, but I knew what they were, and I came across a meme recently that I think captures where so many of us are at. Right, the meme said this: emotionally, I'm done. Mentally, I feel drained. Spiritually, I feel dead. Physically, I smile. Right? I think that captures so much of our existence. And if you slow down enough to take that on and to hear that, it's so sad. It's such a heartbreaking statement of where we're at, where society's at. That's the world we live in. We live in a world that's fallen apart, even as we look beautiful. And I think it's because we're immersed in a culture that tells you the number one thing to chase is pleasure, and the number one thing to avoid is pain. That's actually the path to flourishing. Now, if you were to use a religious word, I'd say that's a gospel. That's a good news. That's a version of good news. It's a news that sounds so good. And we all want good news. We need good news. But the problem with that good news, that gospel, is that it leaves us feeling trapped and lonely and empty. Partly because no matter how hard we pursue pleasure, we can't feel it all the time. And no matter how hard we avoid pain, it still creeps up on us. It still seeps in and seeps out. It's unavoidable. And so if that's the path to flourishing, to maximizing pleasure, to avoiding pain, it's a path inevitably that leads to ruin, because it's not something that's achievable. Now, the thing is, I'm probably speaking more to religious people, right? And to people who are Christians, people who follow Jesus. Even if you're not a Christian, if you'd say you're religious, maybe you are a Buddhist or something like that, I'd say to some degree we're all secular, right? Even for those of us who say, I believe in God, I have a faith. Because it's not that you and I don't believe in God. I believe in God. I love God. I love Jesus. I believe in the Bible. I believe that the Bible is God's revelation to us. But to lesser and to greater degrees, all of us, we live under the dome that we were talking about over the last episode or so. We look to ourselves and we look within ourselves before we even think to look to God. We find ourselves making decisions about our lives by this internal pain pleasure metric, and most of the time it's unthinking, right? It's instinctive. We do it naturally. It's natural because it's the water we're in as fish. It's the air we breathe. We're constantly making choices that will lessen our discomfort or increase our pleasure. Let me just increase my pleasure for a moment. But it feels normal. To live any other way actually feels abnormal. To live any other way requires thinking and thought because it's not natural. It's not the way that we're wired. And I think we can be really thankful for the increasing freedom that we have to make choices about how we live our lives. I live in Australia. If you're an Aussie, we are so blessed, right? We have so much freedom to live our lives. But the you to you way of living, the you to you way of finding meaning, or the you to you way of prioritizing personal freedom and happiness, I think it comes at a really high cost. There's increasing evidence to suggest that the world that we live in, this pain pleasure world, is actually exacerbating mental health. It's actually increasing anxiety at an alarming rate. I found an article online. I don't think I've got the source below, so feel free to disbelieve it. But even if you do believe it, everything I say and everything you say, if it's pushing us or encouraging us to think about things and believe, it's going to be contested anyway, right? That's the world we live in. But I found this article that said this. It said, according to a recent survey by the National Youth Mental Health Foundation, so there's the source, we can chase it there. University and TAFE campuses in Australia are reporting epidemic levels of mental health issues, with 70% of students reporting high to very high levels of psychological distress. Let's just pause there for a second. 70% of students, university students, TAFE students, saying, hey, mental health, high levels of stress, that's me. That's 70%. That's just phenomenal. And not only is our culture leading to a growing mental health crisis, but it's also leading to a lack of resilience. Because despite the amazing, and there have been amazing advances in medical science in our lifetime. If you're younger, there's still been amazing advances, right? Amazing advances in our lifetime. But all human lives are still marked by things like illness and heartbreak and tragedy and loneliness and grief. Brian Rosner, who's the principal of Ridley College in Melbourne, that's the Bible college I attended, he's written a number of books. His most recent book, unless I'm out of touch, is Finding Yourself. It's a great read. There's a plug. Really good engagement around identity and engaging with this idea of who am I? How do you find yourself? He argues that the self-made self, that is when meaning making and identity and flourishing is your job, when you've got to come up with that from within yourself, that this self-made self is not actually suited to cope with adversity because it creates these unrealistic expectations for life. According to social researcher Hugh Mackay, he's a bit of a legend, many young people in the West today are in the group of what he calls the Utopia Complex. What he means, a Utopia Complex is a world we dream of, and not only dream of, we dream of it and then we think we're entitled to it, and the outcomes of this utopian world, of course, are always positive. So think about that, right? He's saying this Utopia Complex, is that we dream of a perfect world, or we dream of a world that's full of pleasure, probably not a lot of pain, not dreaming about that. And then, not only do we dream of it, we develop a sense of entitlement. We actually think that's what we deserve. That's our right. That's our birthright. That we deserve it, not even because we've earned it, just because we determined it. And then we envisage those entitlements as to always having a positive outcome. It's always going to be good. It's always going to be positive. Like, hello, does that sound like real life to anyone? Like, no, of course not. But if that's your internal driver, and if that's how you genuinely believe, if that's how you've been cultivated and raised, and that's your genuine perspective of the world, like, hello to a bucket load of disappointment and hopes dashed, right? Rosner points out, he says, since we exist precariously on this planet, in a world characterized by futility and frustration, then utopia is unattainable. Well, maybe just your world, Brian. Maybe you're just full of futility and frustration. My world's perfect. Look at my Instagram feed. And despite our fear of missing out, he says, well, you know what? True story, we all do miss out in the end. Oh, it's one of my great fears. I was shocked to discover this because, I'm a bit older. I'm meant to be a bit more mature and stuff. I have this deep fear of missing out. I'm heading off to travel shortly, and I've got to work while I'm there. And part of me is like anxious because I'm like, oh man, I've got to do this work. And my wife and my kids are going to have this amazing time doing this cool thing over there, and I'm just going to be doing this, and I'm going to be missing out. Afraid of missing out. But of course, like we all miss out in the end. We all will fall short of our hopes and expectations. The self-made self, formed by only looking inward, inflated by unrealistic expectations, is ill-equipped, he writes, this is Rosner, to cope with life struggles and will likely be crushed under the weight of its disappointments. It's pretty bleak. It's pretty bleak, and it's not because it's not true. He's saying it's actually the outcome of a distortion. It's an outcome of a lack of reality. It's a cultural creation. And if you're a Christian, then this shouldn't surprise you. You shouldn't be surprised by this. Because we weren't designed, no matter how normal it feels and how much we do it ourselves, how easily we fall into this because we live under the dome. We're secularized to some degree. We weren't designed to find our identity by looking within, but looking to God, looking outside, looking to our Creator. Unfortunately, we breathe the same secular air, we fish at the same water, we find ourselves impacted by the secular age in which we live. And so whether we like it or not, even if you say, no, that's not me, no, friend, our own worldviews have been shaped by secularism. To a greater or lesser extent, we've been molded, we've been sucked into this secular mindset. We believe at some level that meaning making and flourishing has its roots and its conclusion, its fulfillment in here, in ourselves. Now, we might not believe theologically that we live under a dome, that we're separated from God. We may not believe we intellectually that meaning and flourishing is found within, but practically speaking, these assumptions are forced upon us, and it infiltrates our beliefs, our thinking as individuals, as organisations, as the church, even churches. This shapes practical beliefs about God and our engagement and understanding of what it means to be the church, to be the body of God. Let me give you a few examples. According to research published in Relevant magazine in 2017, so 6 years old now, as time of recording, only 17% of Christians, so that's less than 1 in 5, have a biblical worldview. Right? Relevant magazine, 2017, only 17% of Christians, less than 1 in 5, have a biblical worldview. Now, the definition of a biblical worldview was this statement. Let me read it to you. Believing that absolute moral truth exists, that the Bible is totally accurate in all of its principles that it teaches, that Satan is considered to be a real being or force, not merely symbolic, that a person cannot earn their way into heaven trying to be good or do good works, that Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth, and God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world who still rules the universe today. Less than 1 in 5 Christians, I believe relevant, this is an American study, believe this. This is core foundational stuff, right? This is core doctrinal kind of creedal statements about how Christians understand God and the world. And this isn't because they don't understand their Bibles. I think it's because we're living under this constructed secular dome that separates us, if you will, from God. We don't look up. It's all here. It's all here. There's nothing out there. We can answer all of life's big questions within ourselves. And it's not just the big stuff. It's everything. Because we live in a culture that says you don't need God to lead your best life. That whether God exists or not is irrelevant. And so we find ourselves being shaped by that, even as we believe. Even as we say, no, I do believe in this. I do believe there's a God out there. I think a good example of this is prayer, right? Talking to God. It's a good example, right? Because to talk to God, you've actually then got to, in a moment, think of something or look up or think of something out there, right? You're engaging with that out there beyond the dome. But when something comes up in your life, and I'm talking to people who are Christians, right? Is your first inclination to fix it, to phone a friend, or to talk to God about it? Because for many people, their last inclination is to talk to God about it. And it's not because you're a terrible Christian. It's because you're a Christian who lives in a world that places a great big dome over us and says, that's all it is. That's all there is. Don't think about what's out there. And so we don't. Says James K. Smith, plugged his awesome book in episode 1. I think I plugged 2 of them. He says this, is even as faith endures in our secular age, believing doesn't come easy. Faith is fraught. Confession is haunted by an inescapable sense of its contestability. There's that idea of all beliefs are contestable. We don't believe instead of doubting. We believe while doubting. Let me just say that again. I think that's really important. I think this is really key. We don't believe instead of doubting. We believe while doubting. Now, that's another change. The presence of doubt, the experience of doubt. For me, when I was growing up, doubt, if you're a Christian, was something you had to try and eradicate. You had to try and bash it out of you. You had to try and believe it out of yourself. It's like, can't have any doubts. And for me, like, as a melancholic, as a not necessarily a bright kid, but as a deep thinking kid, I was full of doubts. I still experience doubts. I'm a pastor in a church and I experience doubts, right? And I grew up in a place where it's like, there's no room for doubt. You're not a good Christian if you're doubting. You've got to get rid of that doubt. It's going to lead you away, lead you down the wrong path. You'll end up giving up on God. And as I said, I'd experience this doubt and I'd feel really guilty about it because I'd wonder if this is all true. Because a real Christian would never doubt. But now, right, in understanding this, like I sit down with my 9 and 11-year-old daughters and explain to them that doubt is normal. That it's not the absence of belief. And whilst doubt might be uncomfortable, I think we live in an age where we need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. There are some of us who, in a sense, have to pay for our faith every step of the way. It's hard. It's hard work. We're racked with doubt and questions and a lack of certainty and sometimes a lack of surety. But we keep taking those steps. And we need to learn to live our lives as believers, as people who trust Jesus and look to Jesus, without the comfort of a culture and a society that shares our commitments. It's just normal. If you're going to believe this, if you're going to believe in Jesus, if you're going to trust him, then that is going to be challenged. And you know what? That's okay. And you're going to feel doubt at times and wonder if it's all true. And you know what? That's okay. It's all right. That's normal. This is not something you have to try and beat out of yourself anymore. Like, this is actually the outworking of living in a secular world. And I think along the way, though, there's also a lot of hope. Like, I have a lot of hope about this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity as well. Like, the writer of Ecclesiastes, one of my all-time favourite books of the Bible. The writer of Ecclesiastes tells us that God has set eternity into the human heart. It's a beautiful phrase, worth pondering. God has set eternity into the human heart. And as the fruit, the bitter fruit of expressive individualism, my life is all about me, and the biggest aspiration of my life is my flourishing and my happiness. As the fruit of that emerges, what remains is this enduring longing and desire for something more. An enduring longing for the transcendent, which, as I said, I think in the last episode, we look for at a horizontal level, but there's a turning towards people wondering, yearning, longing for something vertical, something transcendent. Because just as a believer, just as a Christian, as someone who experiences doubt in my beliefs, so too my friends who are not believers, they too experience doubt in the midst of their unbelief. James K. Smith, in his book, he has this beautiful line. It's not his, but he draws it, he unpacks it well. It's the first line of a book by Julian Barnes, Nothing to be Frightened of. And the line goes like this. He says, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." I don't believe in God, but I miss him. Friends, I think that, and I don't think Julian Barnes intended it in this way, but I think that captures the unrecognised, unspoken, deep longing in the hearts of all of us, of you, of me, of our family, our friends, our neighbours. In his book, James K. Smith gives examples, a number of examples of people who were held up as kind of the heroes of progressive secularism. And the one that I found particularly striking was that of Steve Jobs. And that's not just because I made him and a lot of other people a lot of money. Even Steve Jobs doesn't conform to this narrative of secularism. When the rubber hits the road, right? When it's showtime, when the lights are on, you can talk it, but when you're faced with it, it's surprising what emerges. And you can see this online. There's a website dedicated to Steve Jobs, but in his book, James K. Smith talks about the biography of Jobs that was written by Walter Isaacson. The biography of Jobs written by Walter Isaacson. And he recalls a scene at the end of Jobs' life that exemplifies the ambiguity, the ephemeral nature of our secular age. I'm reading here. It says this. One sunny afternoon, when he wasn't feeling well, Jobs sat in the garden behind his house and reflected on death. "I'm about 50-50 on believing in God," he said. "For most of my life, I felt there must be more to our existence than meets the eye." He admitted that as he faced death, he might be overestimating the odds out of a desire to believe in an afterlife. "I like to think that something survives after you die," he said. "It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures." He fell silent for a very long time. But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch. He said, click, and you're gone. Then he paused again and smiled slightly. Maybe that's why I never liked to put on-off switches on Apple devices. They are still very practical, just for the record. More and more people in our pain-pleasure world are searching for something enduring and something transcendent. And I think there's an opportunity as the church, as believers gathered together, as Christians, that we might be a signpost to both of those things. That as we and people around us, if we're unthinking, as we reap the consequences as we reap the consequences of a world that says you're responsible for your own meaning and flourishing, that's a heavy load to bear. That people might begin to shift their gaze from themselves to God. If you're a believer, don't you find that within yourself? I know I do. And our opportunity is to be found ready, to be waiting, having been people who are recalibrated, if you will, people who are operating out of a worldview, an alternate worldview that prefers others, that is willing to lay down our lives in love for others. I think of the Apostle Peter, his exhortation in 1 Peter 2. He writes this, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans. Live such good lives amongst those who don't believe in God, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." In other words, they may see your good deeds and then themselves find that they begin to believe in God for themselves. Because we are yet to still see humans that are fully transformed by God, and we won't be until heaven. And as we live under the dome, we live as people often limited by our lack of imagination of what we can be in Jesus and what the church could be. I think to recognize that this is the world that we live in, a pain-pleasure world, to be honest about how it shapes us, is a really positive thing. It is a really hopeful and helpful thing. To gently continue through our practices and through our presence to take part in contesting the beliefs and views of our culture, contesting the view that this is all that there is. To encourage people to reimagine that there might be a heaven, that there might be a God, that there might be a deeper, much more meaningful way of experiencing and understanding flourishing than what we currently know as the self, as the locus of meaning. And to discover that I think the more you reimagine, the less difficult it will be. And the more easily you begin to shape your life around what you can't see rather than what merely can be. I think it's Steve McAlpine who has a blog post, and he takes the words of the Beatles, that John Lennon song, Imagine, beautiful tune, haunting, right? And he writes about reimagining. Let me encourage you to check it out. It's well worth a read. But I think there's a challenge for us as people who live under the dome, who combat this idea that flourishing and meaning is all to be found within us, and we're responsible for that, to reimagine what it might be like if God wasn't just out there but somewhere here, connected to us, calling us, inviting us to be a part of something far bigger than we currently imagine. I'm going to finish with a poem. It was written by Jean Murray Walker. I heard it first in J.K. Smith's lecture at the Wheaton Institute in, I think it was 2016. You can find it on YouTube. I've shared it with a few friends. It goes for about an hour, 15, hour, 20 minutes. Brilliant. But he brings this poem, and I think this poem beautifully captures the enduring longing for God in all people, including those who don't think he exists. And I think that gives us hope as Christians, that God himself is not bound by the dome, that no one is unreachable, that even as people cease to look up, that they still might yet experience and know the transcendent, because God comes down, God engages with us. It gives me hope that the church can be reset as that precious jewel that's been knocked out of its claws, reset and point powerfully to the one in Jesus whose love conquers all. Let me finish with this poem. It's called Staying Power. Like Gorky, I sometimes follow my doubts outside to the yard and question the sky, longing to have the fight settled, thinking, I can't go on like this. And finally I say, all right, it is improbable. All right, there is no God. And then, as if I'm focusing a magnifying glass on dry leaves, God blazes up. It's the attention maybe to what isn't there that makes the emptiness flare like a forest fire, until I have to spend the afternoon dragging the hose to put the smouldering thing out. Even on an ordinary day, when a friend calls, tells me they've found a melanoma, complains that the hospital is cold, I say, God, I say as my heart turns inside out. Pick up any language by the scruff of its neck, wipe its face and set it down on the lawn, and I bet it will toddle right into the godfire again, which, though they say doesn't exist, can send you straight to the burn unit. We have only so many words to think with. Say God's not a fire. Say anything. Say God's a phone, maybe. You know you didn't order a phone, but there it is. It rings. You don't know who it could be. You don't want to talk, so you pull out the plug. It rings. You smash it with a hammer till it bleeds, springs and coils and clobbery metal bits. It rings again. You pick it up, and a voice you love whispers, hello. Friends, thanks for sticking with me. Look forward to picking it up in our next episode.